My talk is called The Data Says I Don't Exist, and it's about how data-driven solutions can fail those with disabilities. I'd like to first of all introduce myself. My name is Kevin Mar-Molinero. I have a very grandiose job title, which is Director of Experience Technologies at Kin+Carta in Europe. That's my day job. Alongside that, I also sit on the British Interactive Media Institute's Inclusive Design Council, and am a member of the W3C's COGA community group, which is assisting the W3C in looking at cognitive disabilities and learning impairments for the W3C COGA. So to move into what I'm talking about today is about the rise of the data-driven. And we live in a world where data drives everything. Its usage is seen as a silver bullet to almost every solution. You hear quite commonly the phrases based on data or data-driven or solution which is informed by data. And it's become something of a mantra in our industry, something which is espoused from the mouths of finance, tech, and design alike. It's a deity that gives us a justification for our decisions and validates our choices. But I think it's important for us to remember that whilst a lot of people kind of speak of the truth of this, there's a problem that inherently exists within this model. And that problem is that data and the data we rely on is often biased. And that's biased before we've even begun. As Cathy O'Neill said in her seminal book, Weapons of Math Distraction, data models define their own reality and they use it to justify their results. And this type of model is self-perpetuating. It's highly destructive and it's incredibly common. And I think it's this side of things I'd like to touch on and talk to you about today. So what do I mean when I talk about this, and what does Cathy O'Neill potentially mean as well? Well, it's that data only looks at what's come before. One of the big reasons why we should be what are called healthy skeptics towards data is that data looks at the past. It looks at what's been collected. Data and data collection relies on this past to predict the future. And if that past has itself or does itself contain bias, be that intentionally or be that accidentally, built into it, then the future it creates will only enshrine that bias even deeper into the system, even deeper into our decision making, and even deeper into society itself. And alongside this, there's kind of two key concepts which I like to consider when thinking about how we use data to make these choices, and what we're thinking about when we're trying to apply data to systems and looking at it from the point of view of our constructs and our decision making. And so understanding that data is or can be biased and that data is or can exclude, we need to understand how it contains that bias, and then where to look out for what that bias informs and why we must look out for it in the insights and the stories and the decisions that we draw from it. So biased data can and commonly is used to create profiles of users, to create sketches, personas, so on and so forth. We look at it to make our decision making. And it can create what I like to refer to as kind of user mirages. They are a pronounced idea of a complete user set because the data we look at tells us that this is who our users are. But unfortunately, if our data only has a certain number or percentage of people within it, those that can engage with it, those we have tracked in the past, those who we have drawn our accommodations and our solutions from, then our user profiles are from the start incorrect because they are missing a certain percentage of people. And part of the reason for this is that we forget, and we don't do this necessarily intentionally, but we forget that we have huge data deserts. We have vast areas where there's simply no data to base our thinking on or to base our decision making on, either because we haven't collected it or because we cannot collect it. And I think from here we need to remember that the tools we are using and the tools you're using, I'm using, the industry's using, can bias our results. Incomplete data happens for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons, by no means all of those reasons, but one of the most commonly held reasons is that we rely upon analytics tools. And there are analytics tools that cannot tell, for example, if your user is using an assistive technology, much less if they have a disability or an impairment, because an assistive technology doesn't necessarily mean that a person has a specific correlated disability or impairment. It can just allude to that fact. They also track by traditional means and methods, clicks, page views, etc. But if that product which you've built, the product which you're using, that product which you're trying to optimize and look at is inherently inaccessible to people, and especially to people with access needs, they simply won't show up in that data. They won't be there for you to learn from. They won't be there for you to plan against and to experiment and to test and to learn with. And the reliance on these tools can lead to significant bias problems. And analytics that only capture those that currently use your systems, it will always, by its nature, exclude those who don't use it. If I take an example, a metaphor for this, if we ask a shopkeeper, for example, whose shop exists at the top of a flight of stairs, if they need a ramp for access, that shopkeeper may say no, because they've got no customers who use a wheelchair. So the expense doesn't seem necessary because they have no customers using wheelchairs. So why would they spend the money on placing the wheelchair in the place? And in that way, it's kind of similar to your analytics tool, which treats those users with access needs exactly the same. And it says, well, we have no users with access needs using our product. So why would we spend the time to make the product accessible to those people? Now, this is quite a negative start, and I don't mean it to be negative, but it's to kind of scene set and see and show where we are and where we're existing right now. And there are options. So what are those options? Well, I'm going to kind of start by stepping back, which is to ask yourselves a question when planning these things, which are, what is your focus? And I think it's an important question to consider. There are two commonly thought of models within the accessibility inclusive design community, which I'm sure people are familiar with. There's a medical model and a social model of disability. The medical model being the one that says that your disability is the cause for your lack of access. The social model, on the other hand, says it's society's choices. As a society, we make disabling choices, and therefore we choose to exclude. And when we're thinking about it from a point of view of data collection, the medical model will focus very much on, say, assistive technology, because by its nature, an assistive technology lends itself to correlation with a disability. It also looks for data based on technology's failures to access rather than people's exclusion. We can look at WCAG failures, for example, and count WCAG failures. This doesn't necessarily mean that we're looking for the underlying reason for why somebody's excluded. It looks for a number of checklist tasks against WCAG itself. And it encourages us to quantify people by their disability. So we are saying that this disability first segmentation exists. So a person who is perhaps living with conditions such as a memory condition will be placed in a bucket under cognitive issues, or a person who has, say, Parkinson's will be placed in a bucket of motor issues. And unfortunately, this does kind of bias against disabled people's access rights because it lowers the expectation. It reduces people to a number. It reduces people to a disability. Now, there are strong arguments for why some of these things are necessary. I mean, certainly we must consider the interaction of assistive technology. We must look at focusing on how the technological failures exist and how they should be remediated. But we need to also understand that we cannot bucket one group of people together because of a technology they use. Somebody, for example, who has dyslexia may be using a screen reader because it's easier to understand. Invertly, we also have the social model. And the social model really for our designs of data, of quantifying and qualifying, it focuses on the exclusion to access, irregardless of that specific disability or any specific disability. And it considers things by user journey, not technology. It understands very much that similar symptoms of disabilities can present via different diagnoses, which is an important point, because if you're testing in one group of people, you may not capture anything, but you may capture something, and we have to differentiate between why. And it understands that that technology is not one-to-one linked to disability. There's a number of decision-making cases as to why somebody would use an assistive technology, but likewise, there's a number of reasons why somebody would not. For example, the ability to afford the technology itself is an underlying factor. And it accounts for a more interesting part, which is the human adjustments over technological access. There is a number of ways many of us will find workarounds and solutions ourselves. And these are not directly linked to technology. They are linked to your understanding and to your own accommodations you've created yourself to be able to make your way around inaccessible products and solutions. So to bring this back to data, what can we do and how can we think about it? Well, if we don't have the data which is provided and sourced in the same way that we would do in, say, your standard analytics tools like GTM or so on, or we find ourselves far too heavily reliant on anecdotal data, we can look at specific things. In the first place, which we can start with, is things like aggregated data. Now, there's a number of kind of commonly used and quite respected data sets, things like the WebAIM screen reader surveys, charitable surveys, such as within the UK, we have an organisation called Scope who works in the third sector, who do brilliant work on producing aggregated data for users with impairments and disabilities, and also governmental data sets. The ONS, or Government Office for National Statistics in the UK, produces reports regularly, and these things can be drawn into our processes and could be used to kind of validate, lead us and guide us on our thinking. And there's a number of positives and negatives in these. The positives being that they're very much sourced by real user feedback. There's a huge tendency to large-scale data sets, particularly in things like governmental statistics from the ONS, looking across the entire population or subsets of population to be able to get valid and useful data. They're reliable. This kind of goes without saying, but we do need to say it. This is source material that is peer-reviewed. It's not throwaway. It's done at scale, and it's not assumed or inferred. Sorry, it's data that is reliable, and it's publicly available, and in many cases free. So you can go to these places, to these sources, and you can take these down. You can use them. Again, there are negatives, and we should never shy away from this, that the data sets themselves tend to be opt-in, which can bias survey results. Take, for example, the WebAIM screen reader surveys. Whilst they are incredibly useful for looking at the trends and the changes within people using assistive technologies like screen readers, they are also going to be biased towards people who are engaged with a community, who've heard of WebAIM themselves. The nature of these things tends to be generalists, so you cannot rely upon them, for example, to segment by market. So if you are looking for specific to e-commerce, whilst it is possible to commission a large-scale report, although people are unlikely to do it because of budgetary constraints, the ONS or the charitable sector stuff won't necessarily be segmented to that market which you're specifically looking for. It also tends to be, or can be, international over national and over local. International data sets will not necessarily tell you what's happening at a local. It's a really interesting piece of research done, of thinking done, which we learned when we were looking at a problem ourselves, which showed that, unlike what I had assumed, the rates of disability outside of major cities in the UK was far higher, partially because people can't move into major cities like London because of financial constraints. The cost of living is higher, and so on and so forth. Also, we need to consider here as well that these are one-stop or once-off reports. WebAIM may be an exclusion to this because it's done yearly, but the majority of them will be published at best once a year, or at best once. So by the time the data has been published, they're often out of date. The second tool in our canon, in our armour, is user testing. And this might sound such an obvious one that we do, but I think it's really important for us to understand that user testing is still data and data points, but we have to be aware of the impact of things like sample size. We can fall quite quickly into a trap of something like anecdata. Anecdata being the anecdotal story of one person, which we use to then represent to everybody. And that one person's feedback by itself is only opinion. We need to look at a much bigger scale than a single person. We can also harness things such as intersectionalities. So finding and thinking about the fact that exclusions aren't always linked directly to a disability. They may, in many cases, encompass more than one or present in more ways than one. And one person themselves may present with multiple disabilities. And the more we can look for the intersectionalities, the more we can understand how they work, the more we can learn from themselves and extend our data sets by intelligent use of intersectional issues. That said, and again, I'm fully aware that for many of us, this is a dream that rather than a reality of our day-to-days, where possible the ability to resolve this qualitative or quantitative user testing with ethnographic studies themselves. Quantitative user experience will show you where the barriers occur. It won't show you how people work around them. So actually, by being able to follow proper ethnographic studies, you'll be able to look at, for example, where the corrections, the human adjustments have come into play. We can also, or should also, be considerate to the fact that for many people who we are carrying out user testing with, it's not the same construct as it would be in many instances. We have to consider the impact of things like spoon theory. So an interviewee in the morning may very likely have a different experience if they're interviewed again in the evening. Their spoons have simply dried up by the end of the day. They've used too many. The barriers they face at the end of the day are not the same as the barriers they faced at the start. Likewise, remember and be careful of the fact that you may actually be testing the system of testing and not the system itself. And I've fallen into this trap, as I'm sure many of us have, where we're running user testing, or user testing is being run, and actually what we are doing is we are testing the accessibility of Zoom or the accessibility of Teams, as opposed to running the testing of the product or the prototype or the design which we're trying to test, because the tool itself is a blocker. So proper considered research and proper considered evaluation of the accessibility of the software you're running, particularly important remotely, is extremely important. And that goes down to things like the language and the ability to explain in a clear and concise manner, something I'm pretty terrible at normally. So it's something I have to definitely remember. And always have fallbacks in place in case the user testing tool falls over. I'm a massive fan, when we do this testing, of most people will usually consider user research to be a user researcher, say, or a user experience designer, or so on. And actually bringing a technical person into the user testing session can give you so much benefit. If you're user testing a live product and let's take, for example, an assistive technology is being used for the sake of ease, I'll go with screen reader use, you can actually almost live debug what it is that's breaking the user testing journey, if you have a technical person in the room to be able to help you do that. And that can bring up conversations which you wouldn't have expected. Jumping into DevTools and being able to say, oh, I can see why you're broken here, or I can see what's failing here, will bring up a whole new level of conversation you may not have considered. And all this is valid data. All of this is important for you to have, because it drives and encourages you to learn. Now, one which I'm going to hold my hands up and say that I have wholeheartedly robbed, but stealing is a great thing in this environment because we cannot possibly know it all ourselves. But this is taken from the UK government's methodology to drawing data, and I think it's a beautiful idea, which is the support tickets that you have raised are data sources. So if you allow your users to raise issues on live, to be able to feed back on live sites of where they're being blocked, you can gain so much important information. Now, I'm going to make a stop here and say we should not be suggesting that you look for people with disability to provide you with free work. That is not what we're talking about. It's not a case of, I don't need to have people doing other research. I don't need to be looking for these problems myself because they'll tell us when things have gone wrong. That is a horrendously exclusionary point of view and a very cheap way of doing it. But by allowing people to report, self-reporting, say via live forms, which go straight into your backlog, you're getting real, true, valuable data of where your issues and where your barriers and constraints arise. But, and again, this probably goes without saying, that form itself must be easy to find and accessible. And redoubling your efforts on that single form is incredibly valuable. From this, we can create taxonomies. And I'm so pleased I managed to get that word right first time around, where you involve each of the disciplines who would be responding to a support ticket, those that deal with them the most regularly, your first line, for example. And they can create these taxonomies based on the barriers which the user has faced, as opposed to whether it's a technical bug or a design bug or a UX issue or a content issue. Instead, address them with a social model. What's the barrier and how do we fix the barrier? And review that regularly. Is the taxonomy correct? Are we looking for the right place to fix? Is it in the right bucket? Is it solving the right problem for the right users? And from this, you can draw out user journey insights of why people are falling off, why people aren't able to access. Where is it that your service, your product, your website is causing a barrier or a blocker? You can iterate this over and over again to create your optimizations and be able to track the success of those things. But there's always a but in all these things. You're still going to be doing your usual A/B testing. You're still going to be doing your optimizations. You're still going to be considering other launches, so on and so forth as you're going. Your product is live, your product is running, your product needs this data, and it's important to have this data. So you also need to consider how you run this, because your A/B testing has an impact. So understanding the implications of, say, client-side versus server-side testing with A/B tests, and understanding, more importantly, how those create exclusion. So a client-side A/B test can be an exclusionary point for a user who hits your site. So you've got to consider the impact on your users, and use that decision to decide between where you run your A/B tests, and understand and cater for the impact. So the load time, for example, in the UI, or for somebody who perhaps has an anxiety, or somebody who relies upon consistent, robust UIs to be able to expect what happens next. Using a client-side A/B test that changes something fundamentally important to their expectation of a user journey can create stress, can create exclusion. Then there's the technical, which is to understand that not all client-side events will be triggered by assistive technologies. So consider within, say, the GTM platform, or within whichever A/B testing tool, that simply having click events alone is not enough. And we've got to consider the way we implement our own testing and optimization experimentations in the mindset and the frame of accessibility when we're doing them. Which leads on to the semantics and the markup impact. A/B tests, let's be honest, can often change the markup. They can often change the semantics, and they can have a fundamental effect on users with access needs who are touching upon your site or working or trying to use it. For example, if they change the heading hierarchy, a test that's injected in and switches the heading hierarchy breaks the consistency and breaks the perceivability of the content structure. Injecting markup itself can lead to inaccessible solutions. We would never try and do this, and I'm sure something everybody tries to avoid, but there is often cases where by injecting something, you're going to break the parsing of the site. So make sure that anything which you write, anything which is added into the A/B test, is itself validated, is itself checked, is itself made sure that it's accessible. Test it before you placed it in. Test it in the way you test any other piece of live content. Make sure that you're not hijacking tab ordering, because if you're trying to change the tab order dynamically as it's loaded into the page, you're going to create pain, you're going to create barriers. So we need to be mindful of this when we're considering our A/B tests. Then there's one last piece, and one which I am particularly passionate about, which is the ethics itself of data collection. So we've talked about the what's, the whys, and the hows, but there's a much bigger consideration, I believe, for all of us here, which is why. Why should we do it? And should we do it? Maybe even more than why. So what should we consider ethically? When we're speaking about data, when we're speaking about data collection when applied to marginalized groups, should we not be more careful? Do we need to collect the data? And there's a lovely quote from a judge called Potter Stewart. I will confess that I haven't jumped enough into his background, so I hope I'm not highlighting somebody with a suspect and dubious background, but the quote I still think stands true, which is that ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do. If you consider this in conjunction with something like Facebook, maybe they're not necessarily doing the second part as well as they should be. And it's kind of tied into the fundamental underlying principles of the API structure of the web itself, the design principles of the web from the W3C. As I'm sure the opening speaker, Tim Berners-Lee, would have agreed with, is that you don't reveal that assistive technologies are being used. So you make sure that your API doesn't provide a way for authors to detect that a user is using assistive technology without the user's consent. And that the web platform, albeit it must be accessible to people with disabilities, if a site can detect that a user is using an assistive technology, that site can deny or restrict the user's access to services that it provides. So to put this in context, consider perhaps the bad actors who may be able to misuse this. I, as much as anybody, can think of workarounds to how you can track an assistive technology. They're not pretty, they're not good, and I'm not going to share them, but they are, to an extent, possible. But as much as we in this conference, we and a group of people and professionals would be considerate to this, think about those that wouldn't. Think about those that perhaps would take the use of an assistive technology to segment employment workflow and decide that somebody's not suitable for a job before allowing them into the workflow to apply. It's not something which I think any of us would like to think is possible, but it's certainly something which is possible, and there are bad actors in any position. There's a lovely philosophical maxim, which is the front page of a newspaper theory. So consider what your decision making would look like on the front page of the newspaper, and if you're not comfortable with that, you probably shouldn't be doing it. So what are the ethics of data collection? Well, for me, they are considering tracking targets. So are you tracking some specific disabilities over other? Are you segmenting in a way which creates an ethical problem? And do you need to do that? So bad practice can also exclude these people, those people with disabilities, the users who don't neatly fit into your assumptions of what the data looks like. It's very easy to say that person X has condition Y, therefore they're in this bucket over here. Does that really give you a proper consideration of what this means? And are you just making generalized and high level assumptions over what people look like? And consider as well that some disabilities exclusions themselves don't even have a technology to track. So when we're collecting this data and we're saying person X sits in bucket Y, are we doing that because that's what we think, or are we doing that based on actually understanding real people and their real problems and their real barriers? Content itself is an exclusion point, and you can't track how somebody interacts with content. So should we be considerate of how we put those buckets together? And does that data you're collecting help? Are you doing it for a positive reason, or are you creating silos? The worst possible thing you can do is create a ghettoized experience of the web for people with disabilities. And then you're doing this to quantify. Are you quantifying to help, or are you quantifying to count? Is this number here to say these barriers that we are looking to address, that's what we're doing it for. Are we doing it to say, I want to count the amount of people who potentially have disabilities, impairments, or from marginalized communities, put them into a bucket so I can go over to my finance person and say, I need to spend the money on this. That doesn't necessarily mean the second is wrong, but we need to understand why we're doing it. And lastly, and I guess kind of seems very obvious, but remember the human behind the numbers. We are, at the end of the day, human beings. Numbers are impressive, numbers are important, numbers will allow you to make financial decisions, allow you to focus which bit of your product you consider next. But sometimes just doing the right thing for the one person is more important than doing it for the 100 people. So ethically decide, is it the points of exclusion which you're going after, or is it the large scale of numbers? So in summary, almost there to the end, I'm impressed with myself. The takeaways are, decide which model you want to follow, medical or social, and understand the impact of that. And don't be ashamed if it is the medical model. Don't be ashamed if you are looking at it from that point of view. Sometimes it's necessary. Understand the publicly available data, but don't rely on it alone. User testing is absolutely vital. User testing on small sample sizes is simply opinion. A/B testing and A/B testing tools can themselves create exclusion, so consider its impact carefully and consider its impact on accessibility. Put the accessibility angle into the planning of the A/B testing itself. Make your bugs public. Your bugs are a conversation. That conversation can make you better. Ethics is everything. Ethics are vital. Data isn't. Sometimes the right answer is just not to collect data. There's nothing wrong with that. You really need to ask yourself the question if you need to collect it. And finally, sometimes, unfortunately, exclusion is unavoidable. So predict it early and plan for alternative routes if possible. There is always a case to say and to ask yourself and your teams, who is it that we are going to exclude by doing this? So finally, I want to say thank you to everybody. But before I say thank you to the community watching this, to the organisers, to the AV team, to the signers, I'd like to say thank you to some of my colleagues and friends. My colleague and friend James Fox, without whom I wouldn't have had half of the experiences and understanding to do this talk and to put this together. And my colleague Eva Faster, who designed the slides and also sits with me on the BIMA Inclusive Design Council. So thank you very much, and thank you for your time.
Great, Kevin. Thank you so much for leaving time for questions. We've got plenty of time, so thanks a lot for the content as well. I myself learned quite a bit. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask questions, so let's just get into the attendees. First question is from Gareth. With user feedback being used as data, how do you differentiate between genuine reported barriers or just opinions about accessibility?
That's a brilliant question from Gareth. With difficulty, and you won't be able to do it on a specific ticket alone. You won't be able to do it on a specific single item. You need to look at it as aggregated across the course of collection. The tickets themselves will lead to trends. The trends will lead to areas to fix. And in doing so, you can then have more educated decision making. It will be by no means perfect, but it is a way for you to understand where you're currently failing.
Good answer. Yeah, that was a good question. Let's do another one. This is from @the_Ren, THEREHN, no name given. What do you think of a reward type system that actually rewards people, as in a voucher to, or something like that, to report their bugs to compensate for time, reporting, and inconvenience? They didn't use the word bug bounty, but I've often heard it referred to as that.
There was a word that jumped straight into my mind. What do I think of that? I think it's a great and lovely idea as long as the people doing it are remunerated properly and well for their time. I think far too often bug bounties are a cheap solution that assume people will give up their own time to do something which should be paid. And it can give you a lot of insight, give you a lot of places to fix, but we shouldn't be expecting free work from people.
Great. Okay, thank you. This one's from Anonymous. I'm just kind of doing these democratically based on upvotes.
I'm hoping that's anonymous as in the person rather than the organization.
I think our stream would already be shut down or something. They would make themselves known if they were here. For qualitative data, how much data is required before it transcends opinion to become real data? We often don't have resources to test with large numbers of people. I think this ties into some of your comments about sample size here.
It does, absolutely. How much is enough? In an ideal world, I'll never have enough. The more you can have, the better. I would argue that probably you need to start looking at kind of the 15, 20 plus range to get true sample size results back. That doesn't solve the problem of the cost. And it's a real problem. It's a problem for everybody, which we all have. In fact, it's one we're currently having and some work we're doing. The important thing with qualitative is to make sure that it's consistent and that you're not coaching or guiding the people who you're using for user research, and that your tests are repeatable and they can be done in such a way that you get clear insight out of it. It is quite obvious that 2 to 3 people is really going to be anecdotal and nothing more. But if you can get it to kind of the 15, 20, 30 people, then you're starting to look at a place where you're getting some really valuable insight. And if you want real sample size, you want to go into the hundreds.
Awesome. I love the term anecdata that you used in your presentation. I hadn't heard that before.
I will be honest with you, I stole that from, I think it might have been Gareth Ford Williams, actually. Who used it, and
who's here with us?
I stole that because I thought it was a lovely term myself.
I'm stealing it myself. All right, here's another one that's also anonymous. Data sets on underrepresented minorities often lack any representation of people with disabilities. How can we ethically and respectfully gather data on people with disabilities? This person's in the United States.
That is a brilliant question. Co-creation is the answer. And also don't assume that we should be creating it. There are sources, there are organizations, there are groups out there that are doing this already, and we should be partnering with and leaning on them. Groups like, for example, if we go into the AI and ML world where large-scale data sets are vital to the success of products. There's groups like Queer in AI or Black in AI who are out there doing this work. Let's go slightly political for a second. There's kind of this colonial attitude that you go and you apply research to groups of people, and then you take that research, and that's brilliant. Actually, no, that's not how we should be doing it. We should be going to the groups who we want to represent, and we should be asking who are the people within those communities already carrying out that research, and we should be either hiring them or we should be using and paying for the research they do, because it is far more important to engage from that point of view than it is for us to come in and kind of run over and bring our biases and our ideals across.
Excellent. All right. That was a popular question. This one is from Charles. How can we increase the number of tickets so we have data and not opinions to work from? I think this is kind of thematic. You've sort of answered that already, but if you want to take a crack at it.
It's kind of inverse to the one which Gareth asked, I guess, which is how much is enough and how do you take the things from it? The best way is to make it very publicly obvious where and how you can report an issue. And as I mentioned in the talk itself, probably goes without saying, I guess, but make sure that the reporting tool is accessible. If your reporting tool isn't accessible, you're not going to get anything useful. So test it like hell and make sure it doesn't break.
Awesome. Yeah, for those who can't see the screen, he had a wonderful cartoon with net. And do you remember the caption?
Oh God, not off the top of my head. You put me on the spot there.
It was just
it was
about,
to do, it was to do with kind of, the fish that were caught.
there were no fish smaller than the hole in that data set in the net. All right, let's get into, we got a good amount of time left, about 8 minutes. This is also anonymous. What would be your advice for an advocate working on data-driven and an ROI-driven company? Should I target ethics or look for numbers to justify accessibility work?
There's helpful advice, and there's my opinion. My opinion is be a nuisance. If you see a problem, flag the problem. Nobody else is going to do it. I would go down the route of ethics because I am drawn to ethics first. And I really truly believe that if you see something which is unethical, if you see practice is unethical, just stop that practice. Now, that's probably terrible career advice to a lot of people because you don't want to get yourself fired as well. But there are important considerations to when we collect data on people and why. And I really do believe that unless us as people, practitioners, crafts, so on and so forth, are the ones who kind of put a stop to it, then we're just going to carry on feeding that beast. The question around whether you should look for the numbers is a difficult question because it'll depend on your product and depend on the numbers you're looking for. So push user testing and push conversations with your users as opposed to necessarily trying to find that high quantified data. I know I've had this struggle for a long time. It's very difficult to get those numbers, and you'll spend longer looking for them and longer putting them together as an argument than you will if you've just gone and done the thing in the first place.
All right. Yeah, that's a nuanced one. Great answer. Oh, this is a good one. Do you have advice for recruiting people for research so that it includes people with disabilities, or at least does not exclude them?
Do I have advice? Yes, it's bloody hard. I promised myself I wouldn't swear on this, so I would have used a different word otherwise. The advice is to go into the communities and to speak to people who you know are the ones who are excluded. I'll give you an example of this. Recently, we've been looking for groups from the traveller community within the UK, and we were hearing from other parties that it's hard to find these people, but actually it's not. If you go and speak to the groups that represent them, a lot of people want to speak about their existence. They want to speak about what it is they go through in their lives. It's just people don't ask them. The last time we did kind of a really large scale piece of user testing with people with disabilities, the one most repeated piece of insight we got was thank you. We don't normally get asked.
Wow.
And that's, I think, the important thing is don't just rely on your usual sources. Your usual sources will give you your usual results. So sometimes it's up to you to put the legwork in and go and find the groups.
Great. All right. About 5 minutes. Let's see. How about this one from Anonymous? How can bias enter the data collection process outside of candidates or tool selection?
It can, do you know what? That's a really bloody difficult question to answer. It can enter for a number of reasons. One of them is your own experience, your own lived experience. If we ask all of our questions in English, we will go out and find a lot of people who can answer that question in English. If you go and ask all your questions in English and Spanish, you will get a broader range of people. If you decide that the bias, that you want to unbias your data set, and you decide that, for example, let's take something like technology stack. IE11 is no longer supported, therefore I'm not going to ask any questions about IE11. You've just written off an entire socio-economic group who can't necessarily afford to upgrade their computers. But that's my decision that's biased, as opposed to the actual kind of current groupings of people. So I am inferring my bias to that thing. So it's understanding your own inherent unconscious biases.
Which is a really difficult thing to do.
It is, although I did the training recently, I realised that my unconscious bias is generally speaking against rich people who went to public school backgrounds, which is terrible, but at least I know it.
So we've got 2 more and 3 more minutes. So if you're out there and you have more questions, get them on in. Ooh, lost my window. This one's from Paul. Paul B, could including a feedback form be seen as an expectation of issues to be found? How do we avoid giving the impression that we know there are problems?
Why do you need to give the impression that you don't know those problems? That's my challenge. We're not perfect. Why should we be perfect? I think, and I apply this principle to accessibility in general. I only know as much as I know. There's a hell of a lot I don't know. We're not perfect. Our solutions aren't perfect, and we shouldn't be pretending they are. So let's be honest. Let's have an honest conversation, because we've got a lot of work to do, all of us. And a lot of the stuff which we're addressing now is stuff we created. They're issues and problems and mistakes that we built into this system. To go back to our keynote speaker, Tim Berners-Lee, the web is at its core accessible.
There you go.
It's our choices that make it inaccessible.
There's not a lot of bug-free software out there either, right?
No, God knows I've written enough into it myself in the years.
Well, thank you, Paul, for that question. Let's see what we got. When sharing user feedback, what are your thoughts about referring to either the assistive technology used or their disability?
It would depend on the context. Depends on what it is you're testing and why you're testing it. Are you looking for a specific use case or scenario that is linked to an assistive technology? Do I want to know, for example, whether Dragon Naturally Speaking can find this button correctly? In which case I'd refer to the assistive technology. On the other hand, am I looking for a decision which takes somebody like myself with dyscalculia? Am I asking somebody with dyscalculia if they can actually interact with a numerical value on the site? That's how I would distinguish. Now, again, to the point which I said previously, that doesn't mean it's the right way, but it's the context which is important.
Awesome. I think we've got time for about one more. This is Paulina. Oh, this is a good one. What has been your greatest challenge on your advocacy journey, and how did you handle it?
It's been my greatest challenge. My own confidence and my knowledge. I think, much like anybody, or much like many of us, I've been doing this quite a long time. And it was something which came from a position of passion because of my own lived experiences. And I was always prone to just fix it myself, because I didn't have the confidence to scream louder that we should all be doing this. I'm fortunate now that I've reached a level of seniority and I've worked with enough brilliant people that I can actually go out and shout and scream and, in a nice way, bring people on the journey. But I needed the confidence to do that, and the confidence to understand people want to listen and they do care. And I think that's kind of the most challenging thing. It's to step out your own comfort zone.
Okay, thanks. Let's do one more. I hope I can say this word right. What do you think of the biopsychosocial model as an integration of the medical and social models?
I think I need to go away and read about it because I don't know what it is.
Okay, I don't feel as bad now. That's a fair enough. I told you I was going to get you a curveball.
You got me a curveball. At least I've learned something.
All right. Well, maybe we'll see it in your next talk. With that, we are at time, everyone. Thank you again, Kevin, so much. And thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of AXCON.
Amazing. Thank you so much.